Laurie, we are on. I think we can start.
Well, good morning, everybody, from a very wet fortified farmhouse in central Italy. And technology makes it very possible for us to have global conferences from the comfort of being inside our own home offices. I'd like to welcome you to the final conference of the SMARTA project, called Rural Mobility Matters. And of course it matters, and it's the fact that we're having to sort of pose that question can be something for the discussion at the conference. How we can develop smarter mobility to serve the needs of very, very diverse rural communities across Europe. And make the most and the advantage. If new technology has something to offer, let's see what it can offer us, in addition to other types of mobility innovation. Now, it's a pleasure this morning to welcome not just a European audience, but we have a truly global audience. I say good evening to those people joining us from Australia and from Japan. Good afternoon to those joining from the Middle East and the Indian subcontinent. We also have people joining us from Africa, and when they wake up, people joining us from Latin America and North America. Just to introduce myself as moderator for this morning, my name's Laurie Pickup. I'm the International Director at Vectos, a very proud SMARTA partner. And I also chair the global working group for the ITF on mobility innovations for the periphery. But apart from all of that, my best CV is that I've lived in rural areas since 1981, first in the United Kingdom and in the last 15 years here in central Italy. And I wouldn't be able to get around without the internet and my 13-year-old little Fiat Panda that takes me up and down the forest tracks. Now we've got an exciting conference for you to tell you what SMARTA has been doing and to draw in the results of other initiatives ongoing in Europe at the moment. We've basically got 4 sessions. The first one this morning will deal with policy and governance, and I'll come back to say something about that. After lunch, we look at the case evidence. We go into some of the pilot sites in SMARTA and also in our sister project, which is innovatively being called SMARTA 2. And we're going to look at what's happening in some of those sites to give you some of the evidence. Tomorrow morning, we get together for 2 sessions. The first session is really taking on board what we found in SMARTA and SMARTA 2, but also other best practice cases from around Europe. I think we have 15 to 20 that we've been looking at. And we'll be looking at the results of the evaluation. And there'll be some interesting opportunities there for breakout sessions where you can really get discussing issues that are of particular interest to your aspect of rural mobility. And of course, the final session would have to look to the future and the social and demographic change and diversity that's happening in rural areas and how we're going to meet those needs and how rural mobility innovation really can step up and meet the challenges of rural mobility in a transition to a low carbon economy. It's very interesting that over the last 2 or 3 years, I've chaired a number of sessions on rural mobility at conferences that were essentially about urban sustainable mobility. And they had a session on rural mobility, a little bit like the World Bank and the UN, just to ensure that nobody's left out. And then I find myself chairing a session where the room is full. There are people in the corridor, there are people sitting on the floor, time after time after time. This is clearly an increasingly important agenda issue in transport policy. But this conference has already attracted over 200 participants in Europe and globally. And I think it shows how much it's coming up the agenda internationally. And really, this is why the European Parliament showed great initiative in sponsoring the SMARTA project 2 years ago. Now, before we get into the next part, I have a few housekeeping rules. If Lucian could put a slide up. Very, very simply. And this is a slide for the whole conference, not just for this morning. We are recording the conference. One thing we found with our very successful webinar series is that the attendees actually increased substantially after the event with people who look at the recording. And also when using social media, hashtag SMARTA 2020, can we really use this event to get you discussing on social media about the issues that are being raised? Use this conference as a trigger for doing that and get onto social media. On the bottom of the screen, you'll see the chat and the Q&A. The chat will purely be for instructions coming from the conference organizers to you in the audience. And the Q&A will, of course, be what it says. It'll be your chance to put questions to the panelists and to the moderator. So there's just a few housekeeping points there. But really do use that social media. Before we start our first session on policy and governance, it's quite important that we find out something about SMARTA and what SMARTA's been doing over the last 2 years, and who better to describe what SMARTA's been doing than the coordinator. And it's my pleasure to introduce Giorgio Ambrosino, who I've known since the mid-90s from back in the Sampo project on high technology demand responsive in those days. Giorgio has been working 30 or 40 years in public transport planning and operations, advising local authorities, and also very active on the European scene, particularly in areas of ITS applications. I'm going to hand over now to Giorgio to tell us something about the SMARTA project. Giorgio.
Yes, thank you, Laurie. Thanks for all to participate at this final conference. It's quite a pleasure to have to share with you the results of SMARTA. If I can share my screen. I show only few. I don't know if you can see my screen. That as Laurie said, that I am Giorgio Ambrosino, that I am the general manager, managing director of MEMEX. You know, SMARTA is an initiative of the European Parliament and the G-Move based when we started with SMARTA with the real awareness or observation that the rural mobility until today, I hope until today, was a Cinderella of the mobility in EU, specific for the solution. There was not the same attention that we are very proud was dedicated to the urban level, that no similar attention was for rural area. We hope that SMART and the other European project work in the same sector could push the Commission, the Parliament to have an initiative. SMARTA started, as Laurie said, in 2018 with the objective of studying and current policies adopted by the 28 to 27 EU countries for rural mobility and possible solution based on shared mobility service, very important, integrated with the standard conventional public transport service. The project, I am very proud to present the consortium that was and is composed by Vectos, by University of Aberdeen, by the TML consultancy from Belgium, and the EIP from Romania. as I told you, that substantially the project activity are related the research about the current transport policies adopted by the different EU country, and to analyze the framework with rural mobility seats and the good practice, and to analyze many the good practices that really are currently operated around the rural area of Europe or also in other third country. That one of the results was to set a set of insight paper of the policies of the different European country, and a detailed report on many rural mobility service operated in around Europe. But we not made only the research, we made also demonstration evaluation, working with 14 pilot sites, each implementing different shared mobility service integrated with the standard public transport service. It's clearly in this period, in this very difficult period, COVID-19, we analyze and evaluate in particular the impact of the COVID, both on the site and on the service, evaluating in particular the impact not only on the service or the mechanism of service funding, but also on the user mindset, that you could understand the impact on the sharing mobility service to share the same trips in the same vehicle. The last activities in parallel, very important, was the engagement and promotional activity. That was the building block of the project, with the aim to creating a community that is very interested in rural mobility service and to use the mobility for developing a rural area. And then we create a strong connection also with all the other European project. You know, as I told you, that we work with 14 rural shared mobility site, and you know that although this very difficult period, COVID-19 period, we were very strongly collaborate with this site, that they form with all the service, the rural shared mobility landscape. You can see that we work with in Kilkenny, with Rinkelink, working on demand responsive transport service and real-time passenger information. We had the good collaboration with SMARTA 2, that they have 4 sites that we evaluate, and we make technical assistance, for example, in East Tyrol for the e-car sharing, and working also to examine in very detail the good practice, 5 good practices lies in Groningen, or about the smart mobility hub. That we all this will be examined and detailed in the 2 other sections, section 2 of today and section 3 of tomorrow morning. Last, that it's clearly this is the objective of our section of this morning, and tomorrow the last section of SMARTA, that at the end of our trip of the project, we developed some recommendation to put in action for a policies framework at the level of EU. That we are very happy to discuss these main issues of policy, a framework for the rural mobility, presenting some our perspective and some our vision or recommendation for developing rural area by mobility service. And then we wanted to share this in this section, and also, as I told you, in section 4. And I hope that we will have a useful discussion, a useful input from all the audience. Thanks for your attention. I hope to enjoy the section. Thank you very much.
Hello, it says the controller has stopped my video. You can hear me?
Yeah.
You can hear me. Okay, let me carry on until my video returns. Okay, let me carry on. Thank you, Giorgio. And I'm back again. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Giorgio. We have this very important panel coming up this morning, but we need some very good short presentations to spark the debate. And we have 4 keynote presenters this morning, 2 from the transport sector and 2 from the rural development sector. And it would be fair that because SMARTA is an initiative of the European Parliament, that we start with Kieran Cuff, who is a member of the European Parliament, a member of the Green Party, and he sits on the Transportation Committee of the European Parliament and the Committee for Rural Areas. He has a very impressive CV, previously Minister of State in Ireland with a responsibility for sustainable transport and climate change, and he's also been a Dublin City Councillor. So this speaks for itself, and I'm absolutely excellently delighted to ask Kieran to give a short presentation. And if I can ask all of our keynote speakers to keep it to around 5 or 6 minutes, please. Kieran, over to you.
Thanks very much, Laurie, and it's a real pleasure to be with you all this morning. And even though my current home is in the heart of Dublin, Ireland, I grew up in a very rural part of South Dublin, and I have, shall we say, not the fondest of memories of taking the bus home from school and having a 4-kilometer walk ahead of me, or the prospect of a lift from a neighbor or from my family. So I have a strong understanding of some of the challenges of rural mobility. But first, I want to thank the SMARTA project for organizing the conference and for the really important work that you're doing in highlighting the need for action on rural mobility. I really sincerely believe that the work you're doing is crucial to helping push the rural mobility debate and spur the action that's needed. And it's clear that if we make mobility affordable, accessible, and sustainable for all, the transport sector needs to undergo a radical transformation. And the problem is that transport doesn't serve everyone well. There was a 2016 study by DG Move, by the European Commission's Transport Department, saying that the total external costs for transport amounted to almost €1 trillion, 987 billion euro, or 6.6% of Europe's GDP. That's about half the European Union's budget for the next 7 years. And these costs are air pollution, noise pollution, emissions, biodiversity loss, accidents, and congestion. And road transport is responsible for the biggest share of this. And that's why there is a need to fully internalize these costs across all modes. And the problem is that the transport offering in rural areas is already lacking making the transport at the moment. So it makes the transport system even less fit for purpose. But at the same time, a year ago, the European Union said that we want a European Green Deal. And I really believe that this European Green Deal is an opportunity to reshape the entire transport system to make it safe, sustainable, affordable, and accessible to all. And this means a new vision for rural areas. Rural Europe is almost entirely car dependent, and with little public transport, this means we have a risk of more air pollution, more emissions, more road accidents, transport poverty and congestion in some areas. Indeed, transport poverty is a very real issue in so many parts of Europe, and we need to address this urgently. An individual is transport poor if, in order to satisfy their daily activity needs, at least one of the following conditions applies. Availability, no suitable transport option there, or the transport options don't reach the destination and the opportunities. If the affordability isn't there with high costs, if the time is excessive, or indeed if the travel conditions are dangerous, unsafe, or unhealthy for the individual. And I've been involved in issues around road safety over the last year. And I note that one of the Sustainable Development Goals that we refer to when we talk about road safety is the SDG 11.2, which talks about access to safe, affordable, and sustainable transport systems. And that's defined for the SDGs in terms of the population, half the population being within 500 meters of a regular public transport offering. And clearly we don't have that in many rural areas. So these problems are manifest. And I see it myself in rural areas in Ireland. As the availability of basic services is reduced, up goes social exclusion and deprivation, and economic prosperity suffers. So with the increasing gravitation of people towards cities, I think the European Green Deal is an opportunity to ensure that people's needs are met and that mobility is inclusive so that we end the dependency on the private car. So what can we do about it? Firstly, we need the right framework. The SMARTA project has found that a dedicated rural mobility policy framework is missing in many member states and at European level. So one of the policy recommendations is to ensure there is a target-bound rural mobility policy in all member states by 2025 and an effective framework in all member states by 2030. I mean, I found this discovery pretty shocking, and that's why I've lobbied the European Commission in recent weeks to insert such a requirement into their smart and sustainable mobility strategy that was published yesterday. And unfortunately, this commitment didn't come through in the strategy, but the Commission has hinted that its long-term vision for rural areas will expand on this when it's released next year. So I hope the Commission will recognize that member states need to put rural mobility plans in place by the earliest date possible. So the strategy is not quite there, but we're hopeful for next year. And I'm pleased to say, after the first seminar of this group that I attended, I went back to my own colleagues in Ireland and I said, look, we need to push for a sustainable rural mobility plan. And as it so happens, when my own party negotiated to go into government 6 months ago, we succeeded in putting the requirement for a sustainable rural mobility plan into our programme for government. If it's in the programme, it will happen. And we will work hard with our colleagues to deliver that and to ensure that there's joined up thinking when it comes to the mobility offerings in our rural areas. And we need to combine that with good data on employment and education. I mean, Local Link is great, and this program has been covered by the SMARTA project. So just to move on and continue, I think there are opportunities in the years ahead. COVID has been hugely challenging for providing good public transport offerings, but there is initiatives like the European Year of Rail next year that will help. And I know from my own experience in Ireland, I see the state spending a lot of money on delivering post in rural areas, on bringing people in rural areas to health appointments, on providing rural public transport. And I think if we can join together some of these offerings, we have huge potential to improve and bring about sustainable rural mobility. So I'm looking forward to the discussion, but in conclusion, we need a commitment from member state governments and a greater commitment from the European Union to invest and prioritize sustainable mobility for all, particularly in rural areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Kieran. Thank you indeed. And again, I can't start my video, but I can thank you. And Yeah, loud applause. I think, yeah, I mean, from a personal point of view, with grandchildren out on the Roscommon Mayo border, I've seen quite a bit of rural transport in Ireland, and I very much appreciate your presentation there as fuel for our debate later on. And certainly, the Green Deal has been a major boost this year. While the initiative came very much from the European Parliament, and one can see over the last 10 years the political power of the rural voice across Europe, nothing happens in projects like SMARTA without the European Commission managing and turning the handle and getting initiatives going. And therefore, it's my delight to invite Isabel Van Doorn of DG Move to give the next keynote address. Isabel, she has a rather challenging role. She's Deputy Head of the Sustainable and Intelligent Transport Unit at DG Move. And this looks at multimodal passenger digital services, which of course includes mobility as a service, demand responsive transport, sustainable and smart mobility. So without further ado, let me hand over to Isabel, and thank you for giving the presentation this morning.
Thank you. I have to admit that it is difficult to come after the previous introduction, because I think that he has a bit stolen my own speech, so I will try to complement instead of repeating. Because indeed, the European Green Deal is one of the key priority of the Commission, or maybe the key priority. That's the first thing. And another point that is quite clear in the speech of our president is nobody should be left behind. And I think that if you combine both of them, you can think about rural mobility. As already said earlier, we have our strategy published. It was published yesterday, and I think that we need to thank the SMARTA consortium and of course the Parliament for having given us the money to have this project, because indeed we have it has helped us to strengthen our expertise or develop our expertise, because we needed to understand the how effective mobility services could be for rural area. And the project has demonstrated successful mobility schemes, and so it will be very useful for rural area, but also for us. And it has also helped us to get a better view on existing regional and national or not policy framework. You have already mentioned it earlier, that we could improve the situation in terms of, if we look at, let's say, the policy and regulatory initiative of the Commission, and as already pointed out by the previous speaker, we have a co-developed integrated EC policy and regulatory initiative. Indeed, we have the strategy, and as mentioned, rural mobility is included, and is included at several places. And I think that it is important to show that yes, rural mobility is important in the whole mobility and transport strategy, and because we also need to enable economic, social, and territorial cohesion. A point is that we need to ensure that rural and remote regions are better connected. The strategy is indeed referring to the long-term vision for rural area, and we will make sure that rural mobility has its own, let's say, I would not say chapter, but is present in the long-term vision for rural area. It's clear that it is important. Beside that, as an outcome of the mobility and transport strategy, we will have next year the revised urban mobility package. And maybe you could say, yes, but it is urban, it's not rural. Well, we also know that there are a lot of cities in rural area. And so we strongly believe that we need to address cities in rural area, and we need to address the connectivity with big cities. And so we will also work on that topic in the framework of the revision of the urban mobility package. And one of the key concepts, and it is not a concept anymore, of the urban mobility package of the EU urban mobility is the sustainable urban mobility planning. And so beside the need for having a rural mobility policy at national level, we also believe that there is a need for a planning approach, so that, let's say, the different means that we could put on the table for having for providing alternative to private car is essential, and the planning approach is crucial on that. Another point which is quite let's say important is the awareness raising of the possibilities that we can use, and on the importance of changing our own mobility habits. And therefore, we also believe that, for example, the activities that was launched yesterday, the Climate Pact, and within the Climate Pact, let's say all the awareness campaign like the European Mobility Week are also important, also in rural areas. Having said that, beside what I have just mentioned, the, let's say, urban mobility tools that can be used for rural area, we have also another piece of legislation, which is the revision of the TEN-T regulation. And the TEN-T is also there to improve the accessibility for rural and remote regions. So we also need to look at that at rural area in the revision of the TEN-T policy by improving the interconnection of the remote region and rural area to the network. And finally, we are also working at the Commission level on a green paper on aging, because this paper not only look at aging per se, but look as a focus on accessibility for all groups in the society, and also at the role of active mobility in rural area. So all in all, I wanted to tell you to thank again the SMARTA consortium, because they have done a great job. We have received so many insights, so many useful inputs for our own policy making. So I can tell you, yes, we will take that, we will take over this good work, and we will try to incorporate that in our EU policy making. And as you have said already, Laurie, it's not the end of the story. Yeah? We still have the other project that we have called SMARTA 2. We were not so let's say creative, but this is on purpose, because we believe that we need to continue to work on these aspects, and I hope that we will even be able to continue further by supporting different projects, providing innovative solution in rural area. Because maybe one point that I have not mentioned, or that we have not mentioned a lot today, is the fact that we need a sustainable or zero emission rural mobility, if I may say so. And we will use all the means, including the digital means that are important to accompany the transition to a zero emission rural mobility. So thank you for having invited me, and I'm quite happy, and I'm really hope that we will have feedback from the participants. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isabel. Thank you indeed. And yeah, you tipped on this issue of the rural-urban continuum, that it's neither one nor the other, that it's very mixed, and in some countries a settlement over 300 people is considered urban. So we need to be a little bit more complex in the way we do it, and also to look at things planning in a rural mindset. And that takes us into the rural mindset, are our second two keynote speakers today, who come from outside of the transport sector, but are looking across sectors, including transport, rural development. And it's my pleasure to welcome Stefan Østergaard Jensen, who works for DG Agriculture, and he's a policy analyst in DG Agriculture, a political scientist, I think, in the past, although how long ago the exams were, like me, it was in the 70s. But Stefan is working very much at current and future rural development, and in particular the initiative on smart villages. So Stefan, if you could keep it to about 7 minutes, please. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Now I'm also unmuted. I hope you can hear me well. Thanks a lot for the invitation to join today, and sorry for being a little bit late. I had some technical problems. I will try and give you a short introduction to some of the support opportunities, also in relation to rural mobility within the Common Agricultural Policy. I will touch a little bit on the smart villages concept that we have, and it's also very relevant in this context, and also share with you some thoughts and reflections about how best to support rural communities also for mobility. So if we move on to the first slide, well, this is just basically to say that already in the current policy, rural development policy, the pillar 2 of the CAP, there are good support opportunities for cooperation, for basic services, infrastructure. I would also like to mention the community-led local development, or LEADER, which is very relevant in this context, and even other kinds of investments could be relevant. So we talk about, of course, now the future, which actually starts very soon, 2021. But as the rules for the future CAP has been delayed a little bit, we will have a transitional period for the following 2 years, 21 and 22. And that actually means that the current rural development programs will be extended by 2 years with more or less the same rules in place and the same measures. However, there will be some extra funds from the Next Generation EU, the recovery funds, another 8 billion that member state can focus on the green and digital recovery. So moving on to the next slide. This is just to really show how, rural development in the broader aspects, how central objective it is within the CAP and also for the future. On the left, you have the 3 general objectives of the CAP, where the first one obviously focuses on, sustainable agriculture. Then we have the environment and climate, the second one, and then the third general objective, which is to strengthen the socio-economic fabric of rural areas. And under these 3, there are 9 specific objectives. I will not read them out loud to you, but you have one of them, which is to have vibrant rural areas, which I think could be probably the most relevant objective when it comes to also supporting rural mobility. So if we move on to the next slide, to talk a little bit about the future CAP strategic plans. So as not from 2021, but from 2023, the rural development support will be integrated together with direct payments and some of the market measures in a national CAP strategic plans for all 27 member states. Of course, to mention also now that negotiations are still ongoing, so they haven't come to close. So everything, of course, depends on the final agreement between the Council and the Parliament. But nevertheless, quite in line with the current rural development policy, the idea behind this CAP strategic plans is that member states will set targets and design support interventions according to SWOT analysis and as an assessment of needs in agriculture and rural areas. And the interventions, of course, have to contribute to the CAP objectives. And in the future, the types of intervention descriptions are really broad and flexible, giving more flexibility for the member states, basically, to design the interventions relevant in their context. But for sure, also in the future, support in relation to rural mobility could obviously be as investments, for example, in basic services and local infrastructures in villages and rural areas. But also the cooperation aspects and the CLLD leader is very relevant here. So now I would like to move on to talk a little bit about the smart villages concept, which I think is maybe to classify as a very close cousin of the SMARTA project, I would say. Just a little bit of the background. It's a concept that has very much been supported by the European Parliament, where certain MEPs have been very active in this field, and the European Commission picked up on it already in 2017 with an EU action for smart villages on how different initiatives within rural development can support rural communities. And I'd also like to mention here the Bled Declaration of which was at the initiative of certain members of the European Parliament that says that smart villages have the potential to increase economic and social cohesion and improve the social equality of societies, which is especially visible between rural and urban areas. So on the next slide, I want to say a few more words about the idea behind. Well, of course, and I think we all know, and you all know, that there are specific challenges for rural communities, such as depopulation and, well, low population density in general. Public services are cut, and of course, also the low degree of connectivity. Fast internet connections are lacking in many places, and these are of course very, very challenging for rural areas, just as the mobility issue. So the potential here is that we believe, an integrated territorial and bottom-up approach to find solutions for rural communities through digital and social innovation. So this enables basically basic public services, also such as mobility, that maybe otherwise would not be possible. And of course, digital solutions offer a lot in terms of solutions for businesses, but also for the transformation of our societies in view of the European Green Deal, where of course transportation also has a huge part to play. And then of course, also enhancing quality of life in general in rural areas. So if we move on to the next slide, there a lot of activities have taken place in relation to smart villages, a pilot project. Network exchanges have taken place with all stakeholders within the European Network for Rural Development. Certain member states already today supporting smart villages in their rural development programs, and also still in parliaments, discussions remain high on the agenda, particularly within the intergroup on rural, mountainous and remote areas and smart villages. And lots of events take place around Europe. I just also want to mention two preparatory actions. The first one is already ongoing. I won't say more about that here because there's going to be a presentation tomorrow in the fourth session. But there's also another preparatory action coming up, which is to start early next year, where the focus will be on possibilities for member states to support smart villages through the CAP and other EU policies, particularly such as the cohesion policy. So moving on to the next slide. some of the things that we particularly have learned from the Smart Village activities, but I think also are very relevant in general when it comes to how best to support rural communities and also in the field of mobility. I think we have learned that the territorial approach is very strong here. We see solutions in a wide range of fields. Agriculture, of course, seen from our perspective, infrastructure, public services, transport, etc., etc. And the strength is that when you look at these things on the local level, it may be easier to see the synergies across the areas as compared to, for example, at the European level, where we've had the policy areas split sometimes in different silos, where it can sometimes be difficult to integrate. Then we believe it's important to support strategic approaches to make sure that there's a strategy behind what we support. So we don't just, give funding for individual projects, but the overall impact can really be increased if there is some strategic thinking behind that this will actually, together with other initiatives, will be for the benefit of the rural communities. It's also important here to highlight the bottom-up or the participatory approach, which is really crucial to ensure that the solutions offered at the ground are relevant and taken up by the people who are supposed to benefit from them, like how we work within LEADER as well, of course. It's also important to try to complement and enhance existing initiatives rather than, if not needed, to define strict measures, conditions at EU level, but really we believe the flexibility is needed for, in this case, for the CAP, also for member states to design the support interventions that are relevant in the different contexts. And then I think we still have to learn more also when it comes to the accessibility of EU funding, and particularly strengthening the multi-funding approaches, particularly within the CAP and cohesion policy. Now to the final words. I just, again, colleagues have mentioned it already, to mention the upcoming long-term vision for rural areas, so I won't say many words, but the idea is to have a vision for 2040. And it is my Commissioner for Agriculture, Mr. Wojciechowski, together with the Commissioner for Regional Policy, Madam Ferreira, and under the coordination of the Commission Vice President Sucha for Democracy and Demography, to develop this. They have already kickstarted the process by sending a letter to the member states, encouraging really to ensure sufficient attention to rural areas under the CAP and also cohesion and other policies. You probably know there was a public consultation this autumn, and a conference is being planned before the communication of the Commission will come later. So those were some of the words I would like to share with you this morning. I hope you found them useful also in relation to the questions on transportation mobility, where I'm really not the expert, but yes, I'm looking forward to hear further your other contributions and also from the participants. Thank you very much.
Stefan, thank you very much indeed. And I think obviously there are many, many opportunities to develop rural mobility in the wider context. And I think you gave a very good presentation of the need for joined up thinking with a rural mindset. I think that's really important. And as we all know, villages are actually pretty good at participation and co-creation when the need arises, and that'll be something we'll bring up in session 4 tomorrow, as you rightly say. Thank you indeed. Our final keynote speaker is someone who actually tries to make this policy work on the ground. Marion Eckhart has managed several LEADER initiatives in Sweden. She's the representative, Swedish representative on the ELARD organization, which is the European LEADER Association for Rural Development, and she's currently the vice president. So we couldn't have a better keynote speaker for actually telling us what it's like to actually implement these things on the ground over many years. So I'll hand over to Marion. Marion, if you can keep it to about 6 minutes, please. Thank you.
I will do my best. Thank you for inviting me here. My name is Marian Eckert, and I am actually the president of ELARD at the moment. I wanted to tell you a little bit of the perspective of the rural people, and I'm also not an expert, so it's really interesting to hear the experts talking about it. I will tell you a little bit actually of what is happening. I will tell you a little bit about an survey that we did in this summer, which is called Which Future Do You Want in Rural Areas? Also because of the long-term vision, we wanted to be prepared what people want to have. So ELARD, maybe not all of you know it. The ELARD network is an international non-profit organization founded in 1999, and we have around 2,200 affiliated LAGs from 26 different countries. And when we started this survey around what future do you want in rural areas, we first launched it in English on the 6th of May, and then on the 8th of June, we had it in 21 languages until the 27th of August, and we collected 3,436 answers from 26 countries. And there was mainly multiple choice questions in the survey, but also one free text question. And you can wait. I'm just moving the wrong picture I'm seeing here. This one is what I wanted to show you. So you can see that the most of the there was a lot of people from local action group answering, 40%, but there was also small and medium enterprises, civil society organization, public administration, and other students, pensioners, and people like that. So I will jump right into the conclusions because the methodology will take a longer time. And one of the first conclusion, or the first conclusion that we draw out of this is that people in rural areas are still asking for basic services and employment opportunities. Employment opportunities is the highest with 80%, but then we have accessibility to services comparable to those of cities. And just short after, we have the excellent communication and transport services throughout the whole of the territory. So this is still a really, really important aspect for the people who are working and living in rural areas, as you know. Also, when we are checking the services that are mostly wanted, we can also find here the transportation on place number 6 after the other ones. So I don't need to persuade you that transport is important, so I'm moving on. And the second conclusion that we had in this survey was that especially in the free text answer, many of the responders are talking about the image of rural areas, and to break it down, they are expressing that the vital importance of rural territories to society as a whole must be recognized. Its image and perception among urban populations and decision makers must be improved with the deconstruction of stereotypes, and the urban norm needs to be broken, actually, because if this is made, then public investments in development of rural areas should be equal to the investments made in development of urban per capita, which also involves mobility issues, of course. So we think it is time to change the narratives of rural, and we should employ and invest in rural people to support this change, because people living and working in rural areas have different perspectives. So the question is it possible to change the narrative? Because do we always need to prioritize the investments made in those places where more people live? Or does that not only mean that we are pushing the concentration of the people to the urban areas? Like the first question, is it more easy to self-organize collective transport where many people live, or where population is more sparse? This is one thing we could ask ourselves, and that we keep asking in our own regions. And the second question is, are all people entitled to get the same kind of services within the country or region, or at least that they could be comparable? Because since we all actually pay taxes, we could argue that the grown-ups, they have chosen to settle where they have, and they just have to cope. but what about our youth and children? Because are they not entitled also to have the possibilities that urban youth and children take for granted? So, and if we keep thinking like that, then this means that if our kids move away because we are lacking transportation, do we think that they will return? This is very, very personal for me because I have a sister who lives in London. Her 22-year-old daughter, she cannot move away because there is no apartments. But for my oldest son, he's 15. And next summer, after next summer, he will start gymnasium. And I will need to find him an apartment because there's no transportation from where we live. So this is really different. And what I think we need to a little bit take care of what we're doing with our youth and what we are putting them through. The third conclusion is that the leader method is very beloved from the people who answer this survey. There are many things to do, but I will not talk too much about it because actually we said to keep it short. I have some statistics from the survey. For example, would you like your territory to continue receiving resources to promote economic, social, and environmental diversity through leader and lags? And yes, 97% is answering. So it is really huge support actually for the method, which makes me wonder what can we do then for the mobility. And I made some conclusions myself. CLLD and mobility, I think that the local action groups can be part of the solution, but not the only one, because even if we do have funding, in many cases you need much more than what is possible. And we have the LAGs, but LAGs have the possibility to gather actors locally around any issue, which is also the mobility issue, of course. LAGs can also promote ideas locally around mobility. And we can support local sharing ideas and part of solutions depending on their local development strategy. But I guess most LAGs would have the possibility in their local development strategies to promote such things as e-bike sharing, car sharing, e-hitchhiking, and so on. And also, we can be used as referral body to public sector before launching traffic supply programs at regional level. And also now, most local action groups are standing to put together new local development strategies. And I think it would be very smart to see how we can get the mobility issues in there in the areas that are interested. Yeah, that's it, I guess. Thank you very much. This is where I live, and there is no public transport. Thank you.
And that looks very beautiful indeed. And thank you for showing us that survey, because it really creates the wider perspective within which we can look at mobility. And I think you hit very much on the young children thing. I did a project down for the county council in Cornwall in the southwest of England some 20 years ago. And the chief transport planner, he said to me, well, when they're young children, there's nothing to do and they can't wait to move away. But when they're 30 years old, they want to come back and there's no jobs. And then we all get old. And I think looking after teenagers and young people is such a strong point. Can I thank all of our keynote speakers? There is such a lot there for the panel to pick up and to discuss. And then to add the final piece of fuel for the panel are, of course, the policy perspectives from our own SMARTA project and what we've discovered. And to do that, I want to invite Andrea Lorenzini, to one of the SMARTA people from MEMEX, to give the presentation. He's a civil engineer, but he's worked a lot on shared mobility and public transport. And he's particularly been involved recently in studies on accessibility and transport inclusion. So let me hand over to Andrea to tell you what the recommendations from SMARTA will be. Andrea, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Laurie. I hope you can see my screen. I'll try to put now in the full screen mode. And yeah, and I hope that this presentation can be just a sort of summary of what have been already said by the previous speaker, because I think that we are trying to also to converge on the same page or on the same line, and this is also a very good outcome from our perspective. So I will just give you an overview about this policy perspective. I will try to stay within 5 or 6 minutes because we are running a little bit behind the schedule. So the first question that I think the SMARTA project would like to raise is why should Europe act on rural mobility? And I think this has been already covered by Kiran, by Marianne, Stefan, and the other. So apart from the fact that rural Europe covers about 80% of EU territory and around a quarter of the EU population lives there, we have to notice that in contrast to urban areas, there have been no relevant policies or program for rural mobility. And probably this has been also reflected in terms of how the funding can be allocated to urban and rural mobility. So as I think Marianne explained before with his example, so rural residents do not have the ability of different mobility solutions. Sometimes there is no ability of public transport at all. But on this, we have also to understand that the COVID-19 is having a major impact on this because some solutions such as car sharing or ride sharing services have been impacted by the COVID with the restriction on social distancing and so forth. And in rural areas also people has to travel further and more because with the centralization of services, they have to access urban areas where the services are located. But the second question I would like to say is that this assumption in rural areas everyone has a car. And if we just stop for a while to think about this assumption, this is not true at all, because there are people that cannot drive by reason of age or condition and affordability, but also because sometimes there is only one car per household. So when there is a people that is using a car, other may not use that. And last but not least, there are low-income households and users that may not have a car at all, because we know that how is expensive to hold a car. So with this assumption in mind, what SMARTA tried to do is to analyze the problem of rural mobility. And as I don't want to enter into detail, but the first point is that there is a lack of policy and responsibility for rural mobility. We tried to make an analysis that spanned for around 1 year with the discussion with National Ministry of Transport, regional transport authorities, and so forth to understand what are the policy, what are the objectives that there are at the national level in each country. And basically there is no policy for rural mobility in more or less all the member states. Bearing in mind that this means that there could be some regions, and we will also have some example in the other session where they develop policy and program, even if national level does not. So this led to limited supply of services, because with no policy, you have less services on the ground. So limited public transport with low frequency, time commuting, and all the technical problems of providing transport to these people, lack of integration, and few opportunities to reach urban areas. And in the end, we got limited mobility. So we got very high dependency with car. If you don't have a car, probably you have limited possibility to join your personal life. There is low level of service that make connectivity difficult. And as also said before, the children and the teen, that's a big problem also for them, mobility. So I want to say that we recognize that EU is acting, because we read that this transition to the stated in the EU Green Deal wants to leave no one behind. But we have to recognize that in these scenarios and in this transition, there are existing mobility deficits, especially in rural areas, that needs to be addressed, in addition to the impact arising from this transition. So I'll go very fast to what are our recommendations. So in what way SMARTA would like the European Parliament and the Commission to act for rural mobility? So it is clear that there needs to be established a new Europe-wide policy on rural mobility, and the Parliament should require each member state to establish national policy on rural mobility, because we know that rural areas across Europe are very different. So there are different steps from European level to national level to regional level to county level, where all these policies need to be tailored in order to address the specific mobility needs of the different rural communities. And the goal that SMARTA would like to raise is that to have a target-bound rural mobility policy by 2025, and so that the effective frameworks should be in place by 2030. So this is quite a long timing, because we think that there is time to really rethink how rural mobility is organized, and so to act accordingly. So moving forward, how can Europe act on rural mobility? So as I said before, by 2030, there should be both a mobility policy which cover all of the national regional territories in Europe, but also a specific mobility plan. It could be a rural mobility plan or a different inclusion within the sustainable mobility plan for metropolitan or urban areas. And it should still remain the national, regional, or local decision about what level and means of mobility and the specific resource to allocate. Based on this vision that should be developed at the high level, so at the level of the European Parliament, and the Commission should then ensure that this policy is applied and enforced correctly by each member state. So I'm gonna just wrap up my presentation with proposing what is the proposed roadmap that SMARTA built. Don't want to enter into detail about the different steps that we propose in terms of rural mobility matters, time to act, a new vision for rural mobility. And also in terms of the timing, maybe we have been, this can be adjusted also considering the timing on the existing policy and programming period of the Parliament. But basically, we wish really that by 2025, all member states are covered by target-bound rural mobility policy set at the national level, so that by 2030, there are effective frameworks in place and every part, so every rural community, every rural area is covered by mobility policy with specific objective, target, and responsibilities. And I'm gonna conclude just to say that if this is what can be done at the higher level, that there is also something that can be done at the local level. So that there is a direction forward for developing sustainable rural mobility. And we try to develop this kind of process where we identify 3 main phases for the development of integrated mobility solution. The mobilization and preparatory phase, where we assess the real mobility needs of the people. The development of the solution phase, where we design a package of mobility solution tailored to the needs of the area, we build capacity and we specify acquired mobility services. And at the third phase, that is the operation and long-term sustainability phase. And we have also to bear in mind that the different phases can have a very different timing. So the mobilization, the preparatory phase could also span for 1 or 2 years for really understanding what are the needs to mobilize the interests of the stakeholders. While on the contrary, the development of the solution phase and the shared mobility solution rollout can be done also easily in few months. And this is one of the final slide that I wanted to show, is that the package of mobility solution that can be implemented in rural areas can span different kind of services. This is a task that we made in the SMARTA project to really identify and cluster the mobility services in rural areas in different flexible transport services, ride sharing services, and asset sharing services. And bearing in mind that these are the different solutions where at the core, there is the fixed route, bus, and rail public transport services. There are other services such as DRT, demand responsive transport, organized lift giving, ride sharing, and also the asset sharing services with e-car or bike sharing services. And the key point is that the implementing stakeholder tune their mind to find a blend of this formal organized, so the big stakeholder, the big player, the standard public transport, and the shared mobility solution. And I'm gonna wrap up just to say that the final message that SMARTA project want to raise is that rural mobility matters. So SMARTA would like to really say that it's time to put the rural mobility higher on the UN member state agenda. And we thought that with this scenario that there could be real benefit that could be achieved in rural areas. So shifting from private car to shared mobility options, so to more efficient transportation services, a better accessibility to health, education, and essential services. And also in some countries, maybe the rural depopulation trend could be slower than even out. And that will be all for my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Excellent, excellent presentation of the SMARTA conclusions. And as you can see, they're extremely strong conclusions, but they provide practical roadmaps for a way forward. And maybe you could take a closer look at the recording after the conference of the stages there and think about implementing them in what you do. And I think one important thing that's coming out there is that all of this needs to be done from a rural mindset, not an extension of an urban mindset. And I think that's something coming across strongly. But there are definite roadmaps and dates when things could practically happen that will be of value to the European Commission and of course to the Parliament and local authorities throughout Europe. So there is the evidence. We've had 4 keynote speakers. We've had a presentation of the SMARTA conclusions. And now we come to the panel, and it's my pleasure now to introduce Brendan Finn, who will chair the panel this morning. Brendan's an independent transport consultant I've known since I think the mid-80s, back in Framework 2. He has 40 years experience in the transport sector as a consultant in transport planning and operations, and he's probably worked in more countries than you can find on the map. He's been involved in a lot of the EU projects on rural transport, including the ones that include ITS innovations. So without further ado, I'm going to pass to Brendan, and he will take forward the panel, and I will assume a rapporteur mode. So Brendan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Laurie. As you've kind of betrayed by that long and checkered past, that there's quite a few of us now on the call that are getting more interested in what Isabel referred to as the green paper on aging. So I think we've a vested interest in the next phase for rural mobility. We're now going to move into the panel discussion. We're a few minutes behind time, but we're going to finish at 12:15 exactly as scheduled. That still gives us half an hour for discussion. So I'd like to invite our panelists to put on their cameras and their mics and to join us, please. So Stefan, Marian, and Andrea, and Kieran, you can remain with us. That's absolutely excellent. I know your schedule is extremely busy, but this is great that you can join us for the panel discussion. And then two people that you haven't met so far is Odette Buntings, who is with the Ministry of Mobility and Public Works in Flanders. And I will invite Odette in a few moments to say just a couple of words about herself, introduce herself. And Professor John Nelson from the Institute of Transport and Logistics Studies in the University of Sydney, although some of us may recognize him from Newcastle and Aberdeen, places a little bit closer to home. So just before I begin the panel, maybe just Odette and John, if you just take just a few moments just to introduce yourselves, let us know who you are and maybe the main things you're working on in relation to rural mobility. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Odette Buntings. As stated by Brendan, I work for the Department of Transport and Public Works in Flanders, and I have about 30 years of experience in public transports from both sides. I think I can say for the moment, from the perspective of the operator, I've been very involved during 30 years in demand responsive transport systems. And now I'm more active at the side of the governance side, because in Flanders we have a new legislation which is called Basic Accessibility, which means creating a whole new network of transport. And I think our case is a very interesting one, but I will give more information in session 4 tomorrow. So please come over there and visit us. As we now, in our case of basic accessibility, you can take it literally. The transport needs to be accessible, but accessibility also means that it has to provide offers to points of interest that are useful for the passengers. And it also means accessible in the way that local authorities and transport regions will be involved and will be getting money to create rural transport. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Odette. John, maybe you'd introduce yourself. And yesterday you were mentioning some fairly interesting development down in New South Wales that you could introduce us to as well.
Sure, thank you very much, Brendan. And hello, everybody. My name is John Nelson, as you've heard, Chair in Public Transport at ITLS in the University of Sydney, and still a very part-time professor at the University of Aberdeen in the north of Scotland, although thanks to the closure of the Australian borders back in March, it's now some time since I was last in Europe. What am I working on particularly at the moment? Well, I have a long time an abiding interest in flexible and demand responsive transport, and have have studied and written a great deal on that over the years, a lot with Giorgio and Brendan and Laurie and others involved today. And I have been able to, since arriving in New South Wales, to continue that work. Just very briefly, one of the interesting things happening over here is an ongoing interest in DRT, albeit under the title of on-demand transport, and possibly the world's largest ongoing program of pilots and trials in DRT, some 25 or so schemes in the last 3 or 4 years, approximately half of which are in what we call rural and regional locations. And you'd appreciate in an Australian context, rural can be very, very rural indeed. And I think it's very exciting to see these trials taking place in a rural context, to demonstrate and to amplify a key message from SMARTA, I believe, which is that there is a lot of innovation taking place in a rural context, and this needs to be emphasized. We also have here trials of autonomous vehicles in several rural locations as well. And in the policy framework, just a note to end my introduction on, and to which Brendan was alluding to, in the current government of New South Wales, there is now a dedicated portfolio for regional transport. So we have 2 transport ministers, one effectively, he's called the Minister of Transport, but he's effectively for urban and metropolitan, and one for regional. And this is quite unique in an Australian context, I think, is an indication of how the needs of the regional and rural locations are increasingly coming to the fore. And that fits quite nicely with some of the comments that Laurie was making right at the start of the conference. So I'll leave it there for now, Brendan, and
okay,
maybe come back
thank you, John, and
later
for introducing yourselves. And we'll move on to the panel discussion now. First of all, a big thank you to all of the speakers for really excellent perspectives that you shared with us. They're all coming from different angles, but I think they're all complementary. I don't see any conflict in what is being presented and the ideas that are there. I just want to pick out one item before we started the discussion, and it's from what Marion was saying. And she was referencing the youth. And it seems to me that if a rural area cannot keep its youth, what chance does it have? And that maybe ties in with Stefan's introduction about the vision for rural areas for 2040. I mean, really it is for them, for the youth that are the youth now that will be entering middle age by 2040, the youth that will be there by then. And it seems to me that if rural areas can remain to be good places to grow up in, they'll be good places to grow old in as well. So, you know, mobility is just one of the enablers within all of this. And I think we all the time we think that rural mobility is not an end in itself. It is a support, an enabler to many, many other things that happen within the community, and this has a purpose. We've seen that maybe a quarter of all of Europe's population lives in rural areas, many more, again, in hinterlands of urban areas and towns and so forth. And that's a significant number of people. And also it's a significant political, economic, and social constituency as well. But there's significant gaps in mobility services. Those areas are very dependent on cars to get around. And that's a very different situation to urban areas. So people don't really have much by way of choices. And we're hearing all the time that this is the case almost everywhere in Europe, in rural areas. So it's both a local level issue and it's a European level issue. So with that in mind, we thought we'd ask the panel 3 basic questions that build on each other. The first is whether rural mobility is an issue of sufficient importance and concern that the European institutions need to give it attention. The second is, well, if so, if it really is, would it be better dealt with by mandatory actions such as policy, legal actions, directives, and so forth? Or is it better to be done by facilitating actions such as encouraging funding streams, programs, and so forth? Or does it require a blend of the 2? And the third then was, well, what steps could be taken in 21, 22, maybe 23 that would start to advance this in parallel to any longer term actions? So let's turn to the first of our three questions. Is rural mobility an issue of sufficient importance that the European institutions need to give its attention? And we could read that in two ways. The first is, do people think that the European institutions should be doing something about it? And the second is, do the institutions themselves feel that it is sufficiently important that they should pay attention to it at the European level? So maybe bottom up and top down perspectives that hopefully will meet in the middle. So maybe we begin by asking, is rural mobility an issue that comes up in discussions among the European level stakeholders? And if so, from which perspectives? Is it traffic, environment, rural development, social need, and so forth? So maybe I could begin with you, Kieran, if you don't mind, that, you know, as from the European Parliament perspective, and then maybe Stefan could join in, and then maybe Odette from, I know you're not a national government as such, but you're as close to that as makes no difference, and we maybe hear it from those perspectives first. So Kieran, maybe you might give us a perspective first. Is it really so important that it gains traction?
Thanks, Brendan. I think actually within the European Parliament and the TRAN committee that I sit on, it does get a fair amount of discussion, but maybe there's a frustration that the European Commission through DG Move is not responding with the attention that the Parliament, that the TRAN committee would hope for. The focus tends to be on the dense urban areas because that's where many of the big challenges are of air pollution, congestion. So sometimes rural transport does become the poor relation. But what I would say is, I think there's a huge opportunity in the months and years ahead. We have both what we call the multi-annual financial framework, our budget for the next 7 years, and we have the COVID recovery money, which is the recovery and resilience package. And that COVID recovery money, 560 billion, I think, has to be finalized by the member states by the end of March next year. So there's a real window of opportunity within individual countries to push your national governments to make rural transport a priority. And that window will close quite soon. I think it's important that people get active on this now. And then also with the 7-year chunk of money, that's not as important because the timelines are not as tight there. But it is important to get in and not just lobby Europe, but lobby your member state government, because we did decide that those recovery funds will be decided by the member states. I think SMARTA is doing great work in raising awareness of the issue, but we need to push the Commission and we need to push our national governments.
Okay, that's interesting, Kieran, and I think that ties in with the roadmap that Andrea presented, which, you know, I mean, quite often in projects we're very naive and think that things can be done very fast or quickly, but showed a 10-year time frame in which the first 2 years was really about getting the dialogue and the engagement with the member states, recognizing that this needs to take time, and also that it's only when you start to get consensus among the member states that then you can start to look towards maybe that European institutions can step in. Stefan, I think you were also indicating a broadly similar time frame of things that, okay, you know, it takes time and there's a willingness to do something, but it probably requires multiple levels of action.
Yes, thank you, Brendan. Yeah, first of all, I think I'm probably not the one, well, I'm not the one to say whether the question has, you know, gets enough attention at the Commission level. I would like to rely on, you know, DG Move colleagues maybe to elaborate further on that. But what I can say is that, as seen from the rural development policy perspective, definitely mobility is one, of course, among several issues that come up as a particular challenge for rural areas. And we also acknowledge and see that many times, not only for mobility, but also when it comes to, for example, broadband, which is also really a matter of infrastructure nowadays, sparsely populated areas, in those areas, it's really difficult because there are not many people there. So it is an issue that comes up also in discussions on the rural development policy side. And further, I would like to highlight, well, when we work in our policy and also in cohesion policy, some of the big funding programs, we work in what we call shared management, as many of you know, and that means it's shared between the Commission and the member states. So I can just echo what Sianan just said. No, member states are really crucial here. And in some member states, also the regions. Member states are really crucial here in terms of prioritizing and pointing out which areas need the funding, where there are several possibilities, of course. So in that sense, it's really important, I agree, that also local and regional stakeholders, NGOs, make sure they have a say when they discuss also with the national authorities on what are the needs, what should be prioritized. So I think that's, yeah, what I would like to say now.
Thanks, Stefan. Odette, maybe if we could maybe turn to you, is that in Flanders, I mean, you've done quite a lot from your own initiative. And is it the case that maybe a lot of what is needed is within the competence already of member states or regions, and what is needed is a push?
Well, a lot of what can be done is within the competence of the member states or the regions, as it is in our case. But yeah, it's always a matter of budget, money, that decides what can we do, what can't we do. And so it really takes guts for a government, for the politicians, locally or regionally, to go ahead and say, look, we're going to do things differently here in our region. We're going for a different kind of policy. And what we've been doing in Flanders, in fact, we think we're not waiting for European guidelines or mandates or whatever, but we've decided let's look at mobility from a different perspective, because it always has been, in fact, looked at a little bit top down. You had the regional mobility plans, you have the very local mobility plans, and then I mean the mobility plans of the communities. But everybody is defending its own area, so that's not that good. And so let's say about 5 years ago, we started thinking about a new kind of policy, where we say it's not only the Flemish region or the local community who needs to have a plan, but we're going to create transport regions, and we are going to get communities to work together towards their transport and transport offering. And so it has taken a while to come to that kind of legislation. And what we're doing now for the moment is preparing, in fact, a network that will be introduced in 2022. And I think what's very innovative in that network is that you will see that not only the Flemish region will have a decisive vote in some parts of the network, and mainly what we call the core network, high density networks, as we call it, usually between larger cities. But that as we talk about additional networks and what we call first and last mile transport, which can be demand responsive transport, but which also can be shared cars or shared bikes, can be almost anything. So we are looking much further than only collective and public transport commodities, that the transport regions have to make a mobility plan for their region. And in that plan, they need to have a public transport plan, which will be subsidized, and they get money to create local transport. So they always are telling us, we don't get money, we can't do anything, because you always look at the larger groups in our region. Now we say here, you have an amount of money, and with that amount of money, you can create your own local transport. And that's what in transport regions for the moment people are doing. And so now communities have to make decisions together to see what are we going to do with the money that we have to get a local offer for our inhabitants of the region. And I think that's a quite new and innovative way of thinking. And perhaps I should add, are we talking about large amounts of money? If we look at Flanders as a whole, it's not that much money if we look at public transport as a whole, because before it was only the land that invested in transport, also DRT transport, and it was about, let's say, 30 million a year that was invested in that type of transport. Now the money that will be can be invested in that transport will be doubled by the year 2024 to give an incentive at the communities and the transport regions to really go for it and to introduce new systems.
Okay, thank you, Odette. I mean, that's leading us on to maybe the next layer, because we've moved through maybe 3 layers. And Marianne, this is where maybe you can give us some insights, is that if the national and regional governments are willing to give the space, from your experience, you deal a lot with the local government layer, perhaps, and with the non-governmental layer. Are they interested and ready to act? Is this something that, you know, all of the capacity, at least the heart is there within the communities that they can respond?
I think that's very individual. I don't think that you can see it in all. I mean, we see that in many things when it comes to rural development, there is possibilities to act on local, regional, and national level. But in many cases, this is not getting prioritized. So it is a problem, actually, what is happening. The possibilities are in many cases there, but it's still not being prioritized like that. And for example, we can see that we need, I think, thresholds from the European Union in what amount of funding should go to rural areas and what amount of funding should go to urban areas. Because I think also, I just taking my own example of the region where I live, they are connecting like the big towns together. This is the most important part, and the people who live outside, they are not getting that support. No.
So I think maybe that's bringing us on to the second question, and maybe you might continue with that one, Marianne, if you wish, or we might pass on to somebody else. The second question was really this blend of whether, because we seem to be agreed that something needs to be done and that there is at least some layer of political will to do it, is what is the blend, the best blend between mandating and placing obligations to act, and then providing maybe encouraging, facilitating like funding or easing regulations and so forth. Do you think people will act if there is no hard obligation to make things happen?
No, I don't think so. I think it is really easy. We see it. We are talking now about the urban norm versus you can compare it with male and female discrimination or not. We need also rules, otherwise we will not be able to cope with it, because I see that the place you live today is like a basis for discrimination, because you're not entitled to the same kind of facilities that people who live in cities are entitled to. And I think when we have seen in LEADER and CLLD that LEADER did not get big until it was obligatory, 5% from the rural fund. And then we have the CLLD now, where we can put also money from the cohesion fund to work with this in the same kind of way. But the take-up is very, very low. And I think in all things that has to do with are we prioritizing urban or rural, we need to make rules and thresholds of amounts of money that should go there. And we are talking about that in every place where we come, I guess. And I think there is nothing different with the transportation issue than with other rural development issues.
Marianne, I think you've just bounced the ball back to Kieran. And think that you know,
But of course, I don't think that we should only go with obligatory. We also need to make encouraging actions. I think that it's always the mix that is important. Yeah. Yeah.
Is it possible for the European decision takers, or indeed maybe Stefan also from the Commission side, to press this, as Andrea had said in his presentation, the need for targets and a clear set of obligations and responsibilities at a very minimum to define what mobility should be, to establish a mobility plan, and to allocate not necessarily a huge budget, but a sufficient budget that whatever it is has been agreed that it can actually get done?
Well, it's difficult for me to say. Well, of course, I mean, we can say, of course, the Commission could propose anything, and then we need the co-legislators to agree, obviously. But I think I cannot sit here today and say this is what we should do. And also, I'm a little bit hesitant because I'm not an expert in mobility, and I'm sure also colleagues from DG Move would have more thoughts on that. But I think, as seen from the rural development policy perspective, I think normally we again want things to go a little bit hand in hand. Of course, the Commission needs to, in general terms, play its role when it comes to funding from the future CAP for rural development. I mean, member states have to justify, make a SWOT analysis of its territory and see what are the needs, how do we see them. And of course, the Commission will already has its own opinions also on what are the needs. And will of course require the member states and the regions to justify and say, okay, is this really fair? And of course, it's a difficult task for everybody, because I mean, you cannot put into a formula an objective, correct prioritization of needs. And that's of course also an issue that's for sure is not possible. But I think the right balance of top-down encouragement, and then of course also the need for the actors to being involved in on the ground as well, to make sure that what is actually proposed is needed and will be actually for the benefit of the citizens in question. That was a bit vague, I know, but yeah.
I think a lot of what we're doing here is just getting the discussion going, because I think quite often there haven't been many fora in which we can have a discussion like this. And maybe if I can put it back to you, Kieran, and just how would I put it? That just from your experience, I mean, working within the Irish government, working with other governments, but also working with MEPs who perhaps come at it from a somewhat different perspective, are we pushing an open door here that as long as the obligations weren't too onerous, that national governments would be willing to say, look, okay, we get it, we need to do something, and that the MEPs, particularly those who represent more rural constituencies or regions, that they say, look, yeah, we need to make something happen, or it's going to be a tough ask to get anything over the line that would put some minimum obligation to act on the member states?
Well, I think any change from business as usual is challenging within the European institutions or indeed at a national level. But I do think there is a moment now when we can think things that were unimaginable 5 years ago. And I think the opportunity of the European Green Deal, which started long before COVID, and then the opportunity with COVID recovery, I think is quite important. I'd always say follow the money, and looking at the pots of money that are available. There is the multi-annual financial framework, the COVID recovery and the Recovery and Resilience Fund, but also the Just Transition Fund. I mean, this is essentially saying to the coal-producing regions of Europe, coal and turf, we don't want you to be digging up coal anymore. Here's money for retraining, for reimagining your community. Here in Ireland, the Midlands, where we take out turf or peat, there's tens of millions coming down, which is big money in the Irish context. And I think that money can be used to deliver on rural transport needs. There's lots of money coming down the pike for electrification, for hydrogen, for alternative fuels, I think a compelling case can be made to use some of that funding for addressing the huge infrastructural gaps in rural mobility. So I guess in summary, if we kind of march up to Europe or to our government and say, we need money for rural mobility, we may not be successful. But if we say, we offer you an opportunity for a just transition, for alternative fuels, for smart technologies, then maybe the funding will open up. So that would be my thoughts.
Can I put a question back then, and anybody in the panel might pick up on this one? Is part of the problem that, let us say it's agreed to make the money available, is that you can't spend it all in one go? It's not like, let's say, for an urban area where you can allocate, say, 4 billion to a metro line or a rail line, and then you can have another big project, and it can be packaged in 2 or 3 blocks and whatever. Whereas when we deal with rural mobility, we're dealing with ordinary people doing ordinary things in their ordinary lives, which is very important to them, making relatively small trips here and there. It's their daily life. But in order to make an intervention, it has to be Europe-wide and pervasive, and it's not easy to spend the money. And maybe that's where the deep linkages are required with the DG Agri mechanisms, but also down at the local mechanisms. But it's maybe not so easy to make that bridge because it is such a diffuse issue. Or am I seeing problems where they don't exist, that people, let's say, like in DG Agri or in others, can say, look, give us the money and we've got the channels?
If you want
I certainly, just to come in very briefly, Brendan, I think the big buck projects, they often get the lion's share of the funding. I'm having a row at the moment about rail links, and we're dealing with the Connecting Europe facility. And I'm saying with these little cross-border rail links that are so important for a small region, we need to invest in them. But the argument is moving to the big projects, Rail Baltica. Let's spend 6 billion on a rail line through Estonia, Lithuania, Germany. And it's very hard for the smaller projects to get the traction that they deserve. And that is often challenging, particularly when it comes to rural mobility.
Stefan, I think you were going to say something.
Yes, thank you. No, I just wanted to say, of course, you can give us the money and then we'll handle it. No, but I think actually you have a point in the sense that when it comes to the Agricultural Fund for Rural Development, we are, or the member state or regional authorities are actually, I should say, quite used to handling the smaller projects. And obviously that is what is more needed when it comes in rural areas, where the bigger infrastructure, transportation, mobility projects, I mean, it's a lot of infrastructure. I assume it would also be more relevant to look into, the softer aspects of it, maybe the cooperation aspects of it. And I think indeed we can say that the managing authorities and the paying agencies for the rural development support are indeed more used to probably handling also the smaller projects. So I think actually it makes sense to say, okay, that could maybe be a relevant vehicle in this context. And then of course also I'd like to mention again the local action groups, and also now we have Marion with us here. I mean, where we really have the fingers in the ground, maybe more than in other areas, a bit involving the people. We have established structures for handling such projects that we could build on.
Okay. John, I mean, we haven't really involved you in the discussion at this stage, but you've got a very broad perspective. I mean, not only the European perspective, but also the Australian one, and quite familiar with what happens in the US as well through your connections with transportation research and boards and so forth. Are there any perspectives you'd like to add to this? And I must ask you, if you just keep it relatively brief, we've about 5 minutes remaining maximum on the panel, but I'm sure you have some insights you can share with us on this.
Yeah, I think one particular observation, Brendan, I mean, it's a shame that we have to spend time trying to justify the need for an emphasis on improving rural mobility, and one of the astonishing findings really, and SMARTA's really emphasised this, is the lack of, I was going to say coherent rural mobility frameworks, but of course it's any obvious rural mobility frameworks. And as I say, that is astonishing. One of the points of argument I think we can use to encourage a focus on the rural is actually something I don't think is particularly featured in the discussion, and this is the whole business of tourism. We want our tourism to be smart and green and user friendly, and many rural locations or environments, particularly if they happen to be in areas of outstanding natural beauty, however defined, are often impacted by seasonal surges of people coming in. So I think that the impact of tourism on rural environments deserves consideration, and may also be able to use as a justification to leverage additional funding. And just one final point in that context, that maybe there is an opportunity related to COVID-19, despite the many negative impacts. Certainly here in New South Wales, as I believe in many parts of Europe, people are being encouraged to holiday at home. And this is providing something of an opportunity for rural locations to emphasize, what they have to offer. And of course, if you believe the estate agents, there may well be people entertaining lifestyle changes which will be associated with residential relocation as well, which may have positive, albeit may have some negative as well, implications for rural environments. So just a few thoughts there.
Okay, thanks, John. Odette, Marian, Andrea, is there anything you'd like to add?
I'd just like to add that I think it's a lot more difficult to get funding for a lot of little projects, as I may call them, because if people are giving you money to do something, they always want to see a return on investment. And if you invest in rural areas, in fact, you have to take the time to see what it's going to bring and what is going to happen. You can look at the return on investment on a couple of years, but you have to look far ahead and a number of years ahead to see what it does with that region and what are the positives for that region, for the injection of money, either in transport or in education or whatever that you're giving to that region. And that's something I think often is forgotten. And in larger projects, if you are building a metro building, you can say, well, 1 million people a day will be using it. And here you don't have that kind of numbers.
No. Okay, thanks. Marian, any last thoughts from your side?
Thank you. Yes, I think that the issues that have been raised are all very interesting. I think what we need is not only we need small projects, yes, and we need like CLLD can provide, but we don't need only that. We also need real investments in rural areas, because in order to cooperate around something, you need to be a little bit closer to the next bus stop, or a little bit closer. And I think I'm not sure how European funding can support that, because the problem is that maybe the region is where you live. They are the ones who are deciding where is the bus going and for how long, and when is it sufficient people riding on it. And we are not like, it's not like we're building the Copenhagen Malmö bridge and we will change the situation completely with that bus line, but it will change a lot of people's lives, and maybe it's really difficult. It's not only about the European funding. I think it is also about the mindset and where leader areas of course can help, but I still believe that it's not only the rural fund and it's not only DG Agri. I think the different DGs all need to have some kind of a percentage that is supposed to go to rural areas. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Sorry, Andrea, you didn't get a look in on this, but you got to say all your main things in the presentation. And I think what the second to last slide that you showed with the atomium and showing you a package of measures that can be simple or complex depending on what the area is, and even if there's no money available, the community can do it itself and so forth, is to say, look, whatever money is available, whatever needs you face, is to try to build a blend of measures that meet the needs of the community. And something, you know, we hardly touched at all this morning on actually what is rural mobility, what are the shared mobility options and so forth, because we wanted to focus on the policy. So this afternoon in the second session, and sorry for cutting across who's going to introduce it, but we're going to touch on the 9 pilot projects that have been SMARTA and SMARTA 2. And for anybody who can remain with us for this afternoon, they will start to see the range of measures. And a lot of what we're talking about, and Andrea said, is about blending different measures together, even if it's at small scale and on small budget, in order to achieve what is needed in that community and let the community decide what it is they need. I'd like to say a very big thank you to all of our panelists. Clearly, we could have spoken for so much longer, but what we want to do as SMARTA project comes to an end is to share our thoughts with you rather than simply submit a report. And hopefully we begin a discussion. We're definitely at your disposal, whether it's at the Parliament, the Commission, ELARD or next ERP, or indeed with any of the regional and national organizations, to continue and contribute to the discussion, which I hope will really develop during the year of 2021. We've gone a few minutes over, so that doesn't give too much time for Laurie to do the reflections and summing up. But once again, and it's a pity we don't have a live audience that can applaud you, but to say thank you very much for your presentations and for the discussion, which has been really, really interesting. My honor to host it. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you very much, Brendan. And yes, my head was nodding so much during that. I thought it was going to fall off. If I might just give some summary points that I'm thinking, a feeling that I get is that there's a lot of opportunity space coming up, but will it happen? And who needs to move to make it happen? Very good point by Kieran to kick off. Yes, political movement in the Parliament, but not so much movement in DG Move, but there's political space being created for the Commission to move into. The opportunity is there, and they need to move into that. So there is an opportunity to change, particularly with funding streams to national government, and this very important point about shared management models between the EC and member states, and the funding streams were mentioned, the Just Transition, COVID Fund, Green Deal, and so on. So the time is right to pressure the Commission and national administrations. They're the 2 targets, and how one might do that, maybe with the SMARTA pathway that that Andrea described. An interesting point was the looking at mobility from a different perspective, and looking at the example of bottom-up community-based planning, particularly with the Flanders case. And I know from my ITF committee work, the government representative from France is saying about new legislation there, which is helping to fund local mobility plans and funding for transport, but some of the funding doesn't come to shared mobility services. So we need to be careful that we bring shared mobility services into the net with community-based decision making on a whole package of transport. I think Marion made a very good point that we need to ring fence rural funding, otherwise it doesn't really happen. Smaller projects would be a lot better, and the fact that we've lived through an urban myopia and we need to change the mindset, so we don't have afterthought planning from an urban area, but we generate planning from a rural base, from the rural community, that is developing. And of course, inside that new rural community comes tourism as well, as John pointed out. And it seemed that what we're doing is we're moving from a focus on transport to mobility to accessibility in general, but these are thrown into a stronger perspective when you look at rural areas. And Stefan made the point about the internet coverage, because mobility is now not just physical, it's digital, it's phygital mobility. And we need to start, we can't just be planning rural mobility and walking around the elephant in the room. And I think that was an important point that he made. And my final point is really, if we look back over the last 20 years, we can see that we had a very strong emphasis on sustainable mobility growth in urban areas. And I think, as Kieran said before, central urban areas. And rural mobility sort of fell off the cart. I can only count 3 or 4 projects up to about 2018 that actually looked at this area from 2000. So you've got, on the one hand, you've got that. And on the other hand, you've got rural development projects where rural transport is one of a number of issues. And I think what's happened is that it's fallen between 2 stools, as we say, rural mobility interests. So I think there's a need to, from what you're saying, to actually get the Commission to recognise and ring fence rural mobility as a core issue in its own right, and not a fallout from either side. So it will be interesting, given all what you've said, to say in 5 years' time, look back at where we are and this event and say, well, did it really happen? Because I think I'm certainly concerned that sustainable urban mobility plans will just be rolled out into rural areas, because what you're saying is that you don't need that. You need green plans, you need green prints. So I think this is going to be interesting to see over the next year whether, as Marion was saying, we really do emphasize rural and a rural mindset and let it flow from there. So I was really encouraged by the whole discussion this morning, and my role as moderator now comes to an end. My thanks to all of the speakers, and I now need to hand over to Andrea, who's just going to be the bridge into the afternoon session. So from myself, thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, and from our side also, thank you very much, Laurie, for moderating this very interesting session, and thanks again to all the speakers. I just want to conclude this presenting to you the agenda that we got also for the other session of the conference. So I will just now try to share my screen to show you to this. So the final conference continues, so you can have a lunch break now, but we would like now to also proceed with the other session. We got a very interesting session, as mentioned by Brendan, this afternoon at 2:30, where we will showcase what were the findings and the practical experience implemented by the SMARTA and SMARTA 2 pilot sites. So we got a very interesting agenda with different presentations, each dealing with different kind of shared mobility solution of this package that we discussed this morning. Got hitchhiking, carpooling, e-bike sharing, e-car sharing, and so forth. And this is the second session that we start at 2:30 this afternoon, and the link is the same of this morning. Tomorrow we'll continue with 2 further sessions. The first session will be held and we'll start at 9:30, and we'll deal with the key results from the SMART evaluation activities. And this is quite an interesting session because we want also to discuss our findings with you. So that's why there will be more or less 1 hour of group work, of breakout discussion, where we will split the audience into 4 different groups dealing with different themes: strategic objectives, stakeholders and framework, user acceptance, and using technology wisely, where we will present to you our findings, and we hope and aim to have an open discussion with you also to see whether our findings are reasonable and agreed. And the last session is the 4th, is tomorrow. We start at 12, and this will really look forward. So we look at vision for future rural mobility, developing smart rural transport areas. This is also the title of the SMARTA final conference. We got this session that look at different aspects of rural mobility and how to move forward. We got, again, a different presentation. Also Odette, that joined this morning, will make a specific presentation about this basic accessibility topic in Flanders. Then we got other interesting presentation from different projects, and there will be, again, a panel discussion to explore what are the opportunities for making better rural mobility in the future. So that's all from also our side as project coordinator. Thank you very much again, and hope to see you also in the other session. Thank you and bye.